One of the things I didn't realize about Willwood brakes is they say that you need to get this center line right down the center of the rotor. But if you look at this caliper, there's a big gap here and a small gap here. So if you center the caliper off this line, you're really not centering the caliper. So I'm going to have to take a little bit more out of this shim spacer and bring the caliper over to be centered. So I did not see that. Unfortunately, you can't just do it by adding a washer because it's pushed too far in. So I've got to thin this out and bring it back. Not a big deal. So now that I've thinned that shim out, you can see that I've got an equal amount on both sides of the rotor. So now that I've got the transmission back on the engine, time to move on to the rear end. And I've got to replace the seal in the rear end. And of course that means replacing the bearing, and the Dana 44s, they're a pain in the butt. So you can see everything's saturated with differential lube. And the problem is you've got 4 nuts in here that have to be removed. And the East Coast gear supply axle doesn't have a big enough hole to put a socket through to get at those nuts. So you'd have to take the brake shoes off and then get in there and take off the nuts with a wrench. So I decided I was going to drill that hole out, and ended up working my way up with various bits. And I got there, but it was a pain because the axle wanted to spin, so I had to put a tie down in here, secure it to the lift so that it wouldn't spin. And then of course my bits wouldn't really cut through this very well, so I would get in a little ways and have to take a Dremel tool with a sanding disc and grind some of that away, and then I could get in there further and further with the drill. So I ended up getting it off. It took about an hour and a half. Smacked my head against the door of the car, and all kinds of fun like you have when you work on cars. But I now have the nuts off, and they're very easy to do the next time, because who knows when that will be, if it'll ever be with me, but at least somebody else won't have to fight it. So now it's off to do the other side. Finally got around to doing the rear axles, rear brakes, and the driver's side, the axle seals were leaking and covered the brake shoes. So I had to change that out. I was able to buy the backing plate and brake shoes as a set. Just trying to track down information on that, but I got everything together. So I could have just got the shoes separately, but I decided I was going to get the entire backing plate and everything already assembled, because they've been taken apart and beat on so many times that time to get new ones. So anyways, in that process, when I went to pull the axle out, I found that you have to pull the backing plate for the brakes, because that's inboard or outboard of the axle bearing. So you can't just slide the axle out with the axle bearing on it without taking the brake back plate off. And of course, to do that, you've got 5 bolts in here that you need to get at, because you've got this plate that mounts, pushing it in, retaining plate. So I got the new one, and I got looking at it, I got to thinking, the new bearing comes with a different mounting plate, but if I put that to retain the bearing and put the backing plate on the back side, so this is the one that's original, and you can see there's a lot of meat that's going to go into the rear end, the housing. So the way I've got it set up, there's a lot less going in. So, 1/4 inch difference maybe. But this way I can pull the backing plate, or I can pull the axle, I should say, without pulling the backing plate. I can leave all that in. And my contention is that this backing plate's going to be mounted to the rear end. So essentially this is going to become the rear end because that's bolted in there solidly. So all this can stay in place whenever I pull an axle, and that would make life a lot easier. Not that I pull axles all the time, but they have to take everything off, the hose and or the emergency brake cable and all this hardware. Real pain. There might be some people who want to see how this rear end housing goes together. So I've assembled the braking hub, or the emergency brake hub, and this bracket has been changed from the factory in that this ear used to be up on the end, and it's now cut and welded in the center. This is the way Tom did it. I had to transplant this upper portion of the e-brake from the old setup to the new one because the new one came with this. So I was thinking of cutting off this ear and welding it to it, and I said, oh, I'll just take it apart and transplant it. So it worked fine. This is made for the more modern cables that have a hook that go around the end, where this one was from our old 90s style. So I couldn't find this hub with this setup, so I had to buy the other one complete and then put these two pieces on from Tom's setup. So going into the rear end, there's a gasket here. It goes against the hub, the backing plate, and then the axle itself has sealed bearings, or a sealed bearing here, and then this plate bolts in, so the spline goes in. There's also an O-ring here to capture the oil. So this O-ring and this seal should keep the oil from coming through, but if it tries to come through, there is a gasket on here. Hopefully that will be enough. So everything slides in nice, and then I've got 5 nuts that go on. So I'll put them in, and then I can hook up my emergency brake cable to get it through here and hooked into this arm. So then I've got the same setup that Tom had before. So as you can see, the entire bearing is still supported. It's just part of it is supported by the ring instead of being all in the rear end. Well, it wasn't all in the rear end before. So in my mind, this is going to work fine. The only issue you might have is on the drum, how far the drum sits on the brake shoe. But I've done some measuring, and it turns out that on the inside it actually sits right on the edge of this lip. So the entire brake shoe is contained. In fact, you can actually see where the shoes have been dragging here, that the entire shoe is just inside this line, which will be good if you ever have to pull the drum off. Instead of the shoe gouging it out in here, it'll actually be making it on the end, so that it'll be a lot easier to always pull the drums off without having to worry about loosening up the brakes to to get it to work. So I think it's a win. That's it for this week.